All right, so I don't think it is a mystery or a secret that the world has been a very, very complicated place the last few weeks. And that's actually a terrible statement, because the world has been a very, very complicated place for a very long time, but it definitely feels like the last few weeks things have really reached an impasse. This is the thing about 2020, you really do feel like you're living at the crossroads of history in this year, because things are happening this year that are going to be remembered, for in whatever frame of mind you want to look at that. But if you happen to be watching this from the future and you have no idea what I'm talking about, at this point we've had several high-profile instances of police brutalizing black citizens. We had a death. We've had several deaths. We've had peaceful protests that have turned into riots. We've had just an outpouring of sentiment from everywhere. And with that outcrying of sentiment comes, the other side of it. We have the one group screaming Black Lives Matter and the one group screaming All Lives Matter. I'm not going to get into that debate because I think it's a stupid debate, to be completely honest with you. But what that does kind of segue into is, when you're watching all this and you're seeing all this unfold, the natural question that starts to form inside you is, what can I do? You feel like you need to do something. You've got to do something, but I know that I can't fix everything. I can't, and you begin to wonder, how do you even start? You're an eye drop in the ocean, basically. And I know there are a lot of people taking part in the protests, and there are some people who are really, becoming social media warriors, and they're just posting everything nonstop, 24 hours a day. And that's great for you. That's wonderful for you. If that works for you, great, good on you. I've never been that kind of person. But you wonder then, okay, if I'm not going to do that, I got to do something. So what do you do? And one of the things I've seen people say is, well, use your platform to talk about things. Use your platform to, do this and that. Educate yourself. I'm going to do my best to avoid, hashtag language. Because a lot of times I feel that the message is received. People understand what you're saying, but the slogan that is used for the shorthand begins to become problematic. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm just saying I'm going to try not to use certain terms in this discussion. But, I see people say, use your platform to educate, to talk, and to do all this and that. I don't have much of a platform. Haven't been in school for, several months. And thus my only other platform is this, a amateur review show that only a few dedicated, wonderful people watch. So if you are one of those people, thank you very much. But let's be clear, I don't get, if I get 11 views on a video, I feel 20 feet tall. But I guess the thing you got to think about is it better to, reach 11 people with a good message than to, stay silent and not reach anybody? So with that in mind, what I've been trying to do from my part of it is to discuss and, put some titles out there that people can go and take a look at. I know they've published several lists of documentaries and movies and books that people can check out to kind of educate themselves about what is going on out there and why the struggle is so difficult, and why people are feeling the way they feel. And I felt kind of proud that as I looked at the films, I've talked about a lot of those films, and I'll give you another list kind of at the end. But I noticed that there was a film missing. And I thought this was kind of a bizarre exclusion. Because if you're going to talk about these things, if you're going to talk about these issues, it's good to get kind of a contemporary view of them, but I think it is also important that we need to go back and look at where it started. We need to look at the beginning to understand kind of how we got here. All right, and the film I'm talking about is 1997's Amistad. Steven Spielberg's movie about racial prejudice. What's interesting about this, and like I said, is that it's oddly absent from any of these lists, and it's been a movie that kind of has always had that reputation. It was out. It received virtually no fanfare. Virtually nothing was said about it. The most it was said was that it was kind of snubbed at the Oscars that year. And people just kind of quietly forgot about it. Everybody. And it begs the question, why? I don't believe, and maybe I'm showing my privilege here, I don't believe it's as simple as just racism. I don't think it's that simple. I think it is a form of racism, but not overt racism. I think there are some uncomfortable reasons why this film has kind of faded into history. And I think it's for those reasons that we need to talk about it and maybe bring it back to a little bit of prominence. So, with that in mind, let's talk about Amistad, and let's talk about why it may have been dismissed as it has been. This is probably going to be a long one, folks, so strap in. We're going for a ride. So before we get into the larger picture, let's talk about the picture itself. So Amistad, for those who don't know, is based on a true story, filmed by Steven Spielberg, as I mentioned, and it tells the story of a group of slaves who are being transported on the Spanish ship, the Amistad, who basically rebel and kill just about everybody on board except for 2 people in an attempt to get back home. Through circumstances, they're recaptured in American waters, brought to America, and this big kind of legal battle begins over who owns them, who where did they come from, who has the proper claim to them. It sounds disgusting, doesn't it? And into this fight comes a group of abolitionists led by Steven Skarsgård and Morgan Freeman. They enlist the help of a lawyer played by Matthew McConaughey to try the case to get these slaves freed, basically, so they can go back home. So into this as well as Anthony Hopkins as John Quincy Adams. It's this big legal battle, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So that's the basic story. Before we get into anything, it's got to be stated that this is just a really good movie. This is Spielberg at the height of Spielbergianness. This is the late 90s, I believe, were kind of Spielberg's golden era. This is when he was able to balance both big blockbuster success with much more pointed human stories success. Not a lot of big budget directors can do that. A lot of big budget blockbuster directors can do big things. They can do explosions and great special effects and all this, but human stories, they're not so good at, or they can't blend the two. Spielberg blends the two and uses his utterly captivating grasp of visual storytelling to tell a big sweeping story that is rooted in human issues. And again, at this point in time, he was the best at that. A few years prior to this, he had done Schindler's List. A year after this, he would do Saving Private Ryan. So this is kind of him in his best period, in my opinion. The acting is phenomenal across the board. The acting and writing is phenomenal. You've got this is an A+ cast. You know, I mentioned some of them. You know, Morgan Freeman, who's always great. So, you know, Anthony Hopkins doing a phenomenal job as John Quincy Adams. Matthew McConaughey in what I would believe to be his best performance. This is probably the least dude bro of all of his performances, in my opinion. Even secondary characters. David Palmer, the late Pete Postlethwaite as the prosecuting attorneys do amazing work. You got Anna Paquin as the Queen of Spain, kind of a cameo more than anything else. But you just have some amazing actors really putting all of their weight behind it. But the MVP of this is, without a doubt, Damon Hunsu, who plays kind of the audience point of view character, one of the captured slaves, kind of the de facto leader of this group of captured people. Not something he ever questioned or wanted, but something that he just, you know, as Shakespeare would say, some men have greatness thrust upon them, and he did. So he is definitely the MVP, and he is pulling some heavy acting chops. Let me explain how great his acting is in this. All of his dialogue, with like two exceptions, 2 lines, is all done in his native language. I'm going to mispronounce it. I think it's Mumbai is what it was. I could be wrong about that, so I apologize if I am giving false information. But he is doing his entire part in another language that the audience doesn't understand. Sometimes it is given through an interpreter. Sometimes you get subtitles. There are large stretches of the film where you get none of that. You just hear him and the other slave characters talking in their native tongue. And in a language that you don't understand, you now have to convey everything to the audience. And he does that brilliantly, flawlessly, seamlessly. It is a spectacular performance that he should be very proud of. I got before we get into some of the deeper stuff, I also got to say this. I got to give huge props to all of the black actors in this film, and there's a lot of them, a lot of extras. What they are asked to do, and what they are asked to represent, and what they are asked to recreate, this could not have been easy for them emotionally. I can't imagine how it could be. I don't care how much of a safe space you create in a rehearsal area. You know, at some point the actor has to go to that place, and it's a harsh place to go to, and as we're going to discuss in this instance, a very harsh place. And it could not have been easy for any of them. So I wanna give just huge props to those actors and what they did. And you know, people may look down on me for saying this, but I'm going to say that I also am going to give huge props to the white actors who had to play slave traders and people who whipped these folks and whatnot. That one I can speak to from personal experience, having to play someone that detached from empathy, and doing such horrible things. It takes a toll on you mentally. It is hard. I can't imagine any of those days were easy for anybody. So for everybody involved in those sequences and the film in general, you have my undying respect and gratitude for what you went through to put this story on the screen. It must have been harsh. And I think that leads us into the segue. This film is phenomenal. You should definitely see it. I thought people should have seen it back then, but I think these days especially you need to see it. But the question that was posed that we now have to look at is, why then, if this film is so good, why did it just kind of peter out? It got the generic, great reviews, stuff they slap on the poster kind of thing, but nobody was really talking about it. And you gotta ask the question why. And the easy answer to go to is, well, it's racism. I believe it to be racism to a point. Not the overt, the Klan style racism, but I believe it is a feeling of denial that does play into this, and we're going to talk about that. Boiling it down, I think there are two things that happened to this movie that caused it to kind of be pushed aside. I don't have any real evidence for a lot of this. I'm speaking just kind of from my observations, so let's just say that right out there. First off, this film had the unpleasant distinction of coming out in the year 1997. 1997 was a good year for movies, but the problem was, when this film was released, there was another film about a boat that was the topic of conversation, and that was Titanic, James Cameron's Titanic. Now, I don't need to go into the details about how much I hate James Cameron's Titanic. It is well documented that I do not like that film. I think it is an awful movie, and I could go on an entire rant just about that, but that's not what we're here to do. The point I'm trying to make is that at that time, I was very much in the minority. People loved that movie. It was the biggest thing in the world, and it was selling itself on the kind of ooey gooey love story, bright colors, big special effects, all true love conquers all, blah 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 blah. Into the midst of that comes a much more serious film, and people just didn't want to be serious at that point. It's, that's I believe that does play a big part in it. I remember, and this is even before I saw Amistad, to be honest. I remember this line very clearly, and my feelings about it have been amplified since I've seen it. But I remember this line in Titanic where Kate Winslet's walking onto the boat for the first time. You hear the little voiceover. Some people said that Titanic was the ship of dreams, but to me it was a slave ship bringing me to America in chains. And I remember in the theater thinking, bitch? For real? Because, look, you can tell me and throw feminist theory at me about, yes, the injustice of her being forced to make a match that she didn't want to make and that she was being treated as property. You can make all those arguments you want to me, and maybe they're true. But I don't care. There is no bloody comparison to traveling first class on a luxury liner to have to marry Billy Zane with what it was actually like to be on a slave ship. There just isn't. And I'm going to use, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it because I think this is an apt example of it. If there was ever an example of white privilege, that is it. Comparing, traveling on first class on the Titanic to being on a slave ship. And then, of course, I saw Amistad and saw what it was, and had a very graphic illustration put out there for me of what that actually was like. And just fuck no. And that brings us to my second reason. There is a section of this movie right about in the middle where Damon Hunsu, through flashback, is kind of, we are getting the story of how he got to be where he is. And this takes us on a very detailed, very graphic depiction of what this character's life was and what the actual process and experience of the slave trade was, from the initial kidnapping from his home village to, you know, being taken to some slave fortress, to being put up at an auction, to the boat taking them. And it is, folks, I'm gonna be honest with you here, it is some of the most difficult cinema in the world to watch. It is, Spielberg is notorious for this. I can't find the words to tell you how graphic and disturbing and inhumane and disgusting and just everything that like 20 to 30 some minutes of film is. I will tell you, folks, I set myself the challenge when watching the movie for this review that I was going to watch that entire sequence. Back in the day, I would fast forward through it, I'll be honest with you. But given recent circumstances and everything, I was like, no, I'm gonna force myself to watch all of it. And it took me several times. I had to stop several times and kind of take mental breaks. I know that paints me as a real wimp, but it's the truth. I had to kind of go, I need to process this for a little bit. It's heartbreaking. And big, this is the scenes and the stuff I was talking about where big kudos to the actors and big kudos to Spielberg, because he did not wimp out. He did not go easy on us. It would have been very easy for him to kind of hit the highlights, you know, and kind of go from there, you know, do his Jaws thing of, you know, let your imagination fill in the gaps. It's like, no, he was not going to let imagination fill in the gaps. He was going to tell you in explicit detail, this is what fucking happened. And I believe that sequence is part of the reason this film got shoved to the side. Let's delve into that a little bit. Here's the funny thing. This sequence is not Spielberg's only example of dealing with issues like this in his films. A few years prior to this, Schindler's List came out, which had very graphic depictions of the Holocaust and life in the concentration camps and things of that nature. A year after this, Saving Private Ryan would come out. And that film is most famous for its opening minutes, where it graphically depicts the landing at Normandy. And I remember when that one came out, boy, people were all about that first 20-some minutes. That's all people talked about. Oh, the first minute, oh my God, that landing at Normandy, oh my God, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Nobody ever talked about the rest of the movie. It was the Up of its time. Everybody oh, the first 10 minutes of Up are so beautiful. Nobody ever talks about the rest of the fucking movie. You know, and it's the same thing with Saving Private Ryan. It's this very graphic, very gory, very brutal look at this, you know, this moment in history that we've always kind of romanticized, but never kind of talked about the reality of it. And that was praised. I believe he won Best Director for it that year, I think. I could be wrong. So, why then was that sequence in that film praised and talked about and, you know, all this, and this sequence, I've never heard anyone talk about it before. Never. Well, I think, if I had to be honest, I think it has less to do with, again, overt racism and more to do with our perception of ourselves. We do not like to be reminded about the uglier points in our history. We don't like it. I mean, and let's be fair. I mean, who wants to be reminded about the worst thing they ever did, or the worst thing that ever happened to them? You know, nobody. You want to process it and try to forget it, and and that kind of thing. We don't like to be reminded of those moments. We don't like having our noses rubbed in it. And with the Saving Private Ryan sequence, and even the sequences in, the Holocaust with Schindler's List, that was somebody else. That was the Europeans. That was the Nazis. That wasn't us. And with Saving Private Ryan, well, the landing at Normandy was and is still considered, one of our finest moments. It was this moment, the greatest generation, these brave young men, fighting for freedom and blah, 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 blah. And this is all true. I am not saying it's not. So please don't take that away from this. But that moment lives in our collective memory as a triumph. It's a thing to be proud of. And when you see the brutality of it portrayed, it gives you better understanding of it, but you're still ultimately proud of yourself. This is not a moment that we should be proud of. This is depicting one of the earliest, ugliest, most inhumane aspects of our history. And again, it is not just hitting the high points for us, and it is not leaving it open to interpretation. As I said, it is grinding our nose in it. And we don't like that. And I think that is more the reason why this film and that sequence have kind of been quietly buried, is this concept of we don't like to be reminded. We know from an intellectual standpoint, the slave trade happened and slavery was bad. We get that. I think most of us, the good ones, we get that. And we tend to think that, well, okay, I've got that. I don't need to go into the details. I get it. But when you go into the details, you see the major issues. You want to know why black people are still mad? You want to know why? The fuck? I mean, wouldn't you? And this is a thing about our culture. We do not like dwelling on the negative aspects of our culture and our past. We acknowledge them, but we don't really deal with them. Let me give you an example. After the Holocaust, they left the concentration camps standing, a lot of them. They're memorials. And, to quote Rod Serling, they must remain standing because they stand as a monument to a point in time when a group of men decided to turn the earth into a graveyard. So we keep them there to remind us of how terrible that was, how bad we feel about it. That's good. That's fantastic. Yes, we should. But here's the thing, from the American standpoint, that's in Europe. That's in Germany. How many monuments to our fuck-ups do we keep? How many of the Japanese internment camps do we have standing? How many replicas, because I doubt you can get the real things, but how many replicas of slave ships do we have for people to go in and look at and really, really feel it? We don't. And I think therein lies part of the problem. We understand things from an intellectual standpoint, but when it comes to really looking at the details and the gravity of it, we don't want to be reminded. And I think the reason this film got kind of pushed to the side and quietly buried was because it refused to do that. It wasn't just going to let us rest on our laurels. It was going to say, no, you need to watch this, and you need to see what happened. And I believe, if I'm interpreting things correctly, which it's always possible that I'm not, I think that is what people are meaning when they're saying, educate yourself. We need to understand these things, not just on an intellectual level, but we got to understand, what actually happened, why this happened, and through that, we can acknowledge the fact that no matter how much we want to deny it, racism has been in our country's DNA from the beginning. It has. You can't deny that. And it hasn't gone away. The system, the ideals are set up that all men are created equal, but that doesn't translate in practice. The system isn't set up that way. Okay, for the nerds in my audience, you want an easy reference. Racism is the hydra within our shield that has been there since the beginning and allowed to fester and grow and take root and poison the rest of it. So any good we might be doing is always accompanied by this other icky side. And I think when people say, you need to educate yourself, I think it is acknowledging films like this that shine a real light on both the actual practice of the slave trade and what that did and what that looked like and what it actually felt like. And also, just how deeply rooted complete lack of empathy and humanity is in the creation of our country. Any addict will tell you that the first step to recovery is admitting that you have a problem. And look, I'm not saying that every white person should be legally mandated to spend 12 hours a day strapped into the Clockwork Orange chair and forced to watch footage of the worst atrocities that white people have ever caused, all while simultaneously being punched in the balls. All right? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying, and I'm also not saying that, part of the problem a lot of the modern generation is having, I think, processing some of this, is that feeling that, a lot of people like my age came of age in what we felt was a more enlightened time. So you feel like you've gone through your life, you've tried to be nice, you've tried to treat people right, and now you're feeling like everyone's calling you a racist. And they're not, one of the things that's hardest to get around is they're not calling you specifically a racist, but the group that you belong to. Okay? That is, or that the racism was started there. I think that's what they're trying to get at, and what people are trying to get folks to acknowledge. And it's a hard thing. It's a hard pill to swallow. It is a bitter ass pill to swallow, no doubt, no question. But kind of like I did, trying to sit through this sequence, I think we gotta swallow it. I don't know if I'm making my point well. I don't know. I'm not as eloquent as a lot of people online. I'm just kind of talking to a camera, so I don't know if I'm getting my point across, but I do think it is important that we, educate ourselves, and I do think it's important that we don't shy away from the uglier aspects of, history. If you want to, if movies are kind of your thing, like they're mine, there's tons of movies out there that you can look at. I've heard, The Outstanding Just Mercy has been talked about. I also highly recommend The Banker, which also came out this past year. Some of the other films I've reviewed, Ghost of Mississippi, Black and Blue. Black and Blue might not be quite as good as some of these others, but I think it's dealing with the issues. It's dealing with the issues. There are episodes of TV shows you can go and check out. There's an excellent episode of Barney Miller called The Harris Incident, which I was watching last night and was like, wow, it's sad how timely this is from a show made in the 70s. Really sad that this is still a thing. Really sad. There is the outstanding episode of Deep Space Nine called Far Beyond the Stars, you know? And there's this film. And maybe you can dismiss some of those other things I mentioned, but I really passionately believe that if you want to start your education, start at the beginning and see where this came from and see how it's taken root and how it's been allowed to fester. Because you can acknowledge how it is for people now, but what we got to understand is this is not a new thing. Okay? This isn't like an ugly thing that pops up every couple decades. It's been there. All right? So it's not an easy watch. Again, great movie, excellent performances, but it's even outside of that sequence that I mentioned, it's a hard watch, but I think it's worth it, and I think it's one that may give you a far better understanding of what's happening now. So I put it out there. Take a look at it. Brace yourself. And be ready. But I'd say take a look at this. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm rambling and I should really wrap up, just do the best you can. I know, like I said at the beginning, a lot of people are asking themselves, what can I do? And other people are going to tell you other things. For me, it's do the best you can. Do the best you can. You can't... At the end of the day, you can't control how other people think. You can't control how other people act. You can't control what other people believe. All you can control is yourself. You can try to influence other people. You can try to talk to other people, but in the end, they have to make that decision. So all you can do is, what's right for you. So just do what you need to do. Okay, in whatever form that takes, and don't let anybody tell you you're not doing enough or you're not doing it right. Just try to do the best you can. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better, try to push forward, and yeah. So this one got longer than a lot of them, but there's a lot to go into. So that's my 2 cents. Again, I don't get off on these longer rants a lot, but I feel like I kind of had to in this instance, and yeah, so that's just me. Let's wrap this up. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope everyone is doing all right. I hope everyone is staying healthy, because remember, these things that are going on are important, but we have this little thing of a deadly virus that we're still kind of fucking with. So, keep that in mind. But take care of yourself, take care of each other, look out for each other, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.